Hello, this is Richard Bush,卜睿哲, speaking to you from Fairfax, Virginia. It is my great privilege to speak to the 19th Global Views Leaders Conference. My topic is the new geopolitics between the United States, Taiwan, and China under the Biden administration. This is a really complex topic, so I can only make several key basic points. My core conclusion is that Washington and Beijing and Taipei continue to be engaged in tests of strength, and that U.S.-Taiwan relations have opportunities for cooperation that we are not fully exploiting. I will discuss U.S.-China relations first, then cross-strait relations, and then U.S.-Taiwan relations. On U.S.-China relations, there has been a lot of media discussion about a new Cold War between the United States and China. I don't believe that debate is very productive. Today's circumstances are very different from the real Cold War. Today, America has extensive economic relations with China that it didn't have with the Soviet Union in the real Cold War. But U.S.-China relations have deteriorated over the last decade, and the two countries disagree on a wide range of issues. Washington can neither ignore the tensions with China nor the opportunities for cooperation. As the Biden administration puts it, the relationship is competitive when it should be, collaborative when it can be, and adversarial when it must be. Although issues like trade, investment, and technology are important, I'm going to focus today on the U.S.-PRC interaction in the East Asian region. From around 1980 until the last decade, the United States maintained what could be called hegemonic stability in East Asia, a long peace. For most of the countries in the region, including China, the risk of war was low and economic growth was rapid. A key reason that hegemonic stability existed in East Asia was the U.S. alliance system with countries that constitute the first island chain running from Japan to Australia, and the deployment of U.S. forces in the region. For about the last decade, however, China challenged America's position in the region. That should not be surprising. It feels encircled militarily and politically, and a rising power generally tries first to become dominant in its home region. China, therefore, has tried to weaken U.S. regional leadership through actions like building artificial islands in the South China Sea, cultivating leaders like Philippine President Duterte, and above all, by becoming the hub of regional trade and investment. It is definitely trying to change the status quo in its favor. One feature of the past hegemonic stability was that most countries were happy to rely on China for prosperity and on the U.S. for security. Washington was comfortable with this arrangement, but Donald Trump tried to get Washington's friends to choose between the United States and China. This is one issue, I believe, where the Biden administration is trying to return to the situation before 2016. On others, there will be continuity. Times have changed, and restoring the old status quo is probably not possible. I cannot tell you how this struggle for power and this test of wills will turn out. Several options seem possible. First, China wins. It establishes a dominant position on the first island chain, and the U.S. retreats across the Pacific. Second, the U.S. wins, and China accommodates a continued American position on the first island chain. Third, the two countries continue the current situation, which amounts to a nonviolent war of attrition for power and influence. Fourth, China and the United States recognize that neither side can win, and they work out rules for coexistence. But there is a fifth scenario, and that is that U.S.-PRC conflicts proliferate and intensify and lead to war. That is a terrible outcome for a region that has benefited so much on peace. As I've said, I don't know which scenario will occur. A key variable is whether the United States has the capability and the will to maintain its position in the East Asian region. That in turn will be determined in part by whether we strengthen ourselves at home. But if regulated coexistence is to happen, it must be because President Biden and President Xi Jinping agree that this is the optimal approach. If they do agree, then they need to order their subordinates to act accordingly. Obviously, each scenario will affect Taiwan's future, but in different ways. Taiwan wins if Beijing chooses restraint over provocation, but Taiwan has the most to lose from a great power war. I will now turn to cross-strait relations, and I begin by stating a paradox. That is, on the one hand, President Chen Shui-bian provoked the mainland a lot more than President Tsai Ing-wen has. On the other, Beijing's treatment of Tsai's administration has been worse than it was towards Chen's. Towards President Tsai's administration, it has engaged in intimidation, marginalization, domestic penetration, economic sanctions, and so on. What I call coercion without violence. By the way, the mainstream view of President Tsai is that she has not pursued Taiwan independence, as China has asserted. In my view, she made serious early efforts to reassure Beijing about her intentions, but did so in her own way. Unfortunately, the mainland continues to charge that she is challenging its bottom line and has been unwilling to coexist with her administration. If my paradox is true, the next question is, why the difference? Let me offer a couple of possible answers. First, Beijing believes it has grown stronger and the U.S. has become weaker, so it can act more aggressively towards Taipei. Second, Beijing believes that it will be harder for the KMT to return to power in 2024 than it was in 2008, so it has to be tougher on President Tsai. Or perhaps the Chinese leadership understands that it will not be possible to persuade Taiwan to move gradually towards unification, as it tried to do during the Ma Ying-jeou administration, and so it must resort to pressure to wear down Taiwan's will to resist. Now, some analysts believe that Beijing is preparing to use force to try to subdue Taiwan, and perhaps do so fairly soon. Personally, I believe the PRC will only use force against Taiwan if the island's leaders move towards de jure independence, which I think is quite unlikely. Also, Beijing must prudently assume that the United States will intervene if it gives the PLA the order to attack. Looking forward, it will be prudent for Taiwan's leaders to recognize that the mainland has never accepted one China different interpretations as the definition of the 1992 consensus. Indeed, Xi Jinping's current definition of the term is, quote, "The two sides of the strait belong to one China and will work together to seek national unification." I assume that Beijing will insist on that definition going forward. I also assume that it will be unpopular with Taiwan people. Now, if the KMT candidate wins the 2024 election, Beijing may return to the persuasion approach that it tried during the Ma administration. Yet anti-unification sentiment among the Taiwan public remains strong, and Beijing may insist that a KMT administration engage in political talks, which the public will likely oppose. If progress in peaceful development is thus impossible, Beijing may well choose to continue coercion without violence in the hope that sooner or later Taiwan will give up. Given this situation, there are a few things that Taiwan can do to strengthen itself, whichever party is in power. The first is to carry out economic reforms to spur growth in the non-ITC sector, to make better use of the talents of educated young people, and to spread the benefits of growth more widely. Second, continue to develop a defense strategy that is appropriate for the PLA threat of today, a strategy that would take advantage of where the PLA is weak, rather than confronting it where it is strong. This will strengthen deterrence. Third, Taipei should continue to create robust defenses against mainland cyber attacks and interference in Taiwan's democracy. Most important, I believe, is that the leaders of the two major political parties create common ground and together forge a broader consensus on how to meet the challenges facing Taiwan. Mainland policy is the most important of these challenges, but the government budget and energy policy are others. The stakes are too high for continued domestic polarization and obstruction. I will turn now to relations between Taipei and Washington, which are not perfect but are still very good and are likely to remain so. The reason I believe is that both President Ma Ying-jeou and President Tsai Ing-wen accepted the status quo preferences of the Taiwan public. Successive American administrations recognized this fact and that it was consistent with the United States' abiding interest in the preservation of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. The goal for Taiwan and the United States going forward should be to strengthen Taiwan substantively, both to deter PRC adventurism and to sustain Taiwan's confidence for the future. Symbolic measures do have value, but the substantive steps are most important. 4 ideas come to mind. First, Washington should begin future-oriented talks with Taipei on a range of economic issues. This could best be done through a bilateral trade agreement, but U.S. politics may make that impossible. Still, sector-specific agreements between our two countries are possible on a number of issues. Second, on military security, leaders in both Taipei and Washington must take seriously the PLA's capabilities, even if PRC leaders say they will stick to the policy of promoting peaceful unification. The key here is to ensure that Taiwan's defense strategy facilitates U.S. intervention if war should break out and the U.S. decides to intervene. Our two sides have discussed this for many years. U.S. defense experts believe that the overall defense concept was a good way for Taiwan to strengthen deterrence, but they now worry that the content of the overall defense concept is changing, even though the name remains. Finally, let me reiterate that one of the most important ways that Taiwan can strengthen itself and U.S.-Taiwan relations is for Taiwan political elites to come together and forge a consensus on how to cope with the challenges that the society faces, including the challenge from China. In the 1940s, the Soviet Union posed a serious challenge to the United States and Western Europe, and the Truman administration proposed a policy of containment. At the time, there were serious divisions in America over domestic policy. And on external policy, some Republicans preferred a policy of isolation instead of containment. But other clear-eyed Republicans understood that the national interest required them to work with Democrats and support Truman on containment. The leader of this group was Senator Arthur Vandenberg from Michigan. His slogan was, "Politics stops at the water's edge." Perhaps Taiwan's interest in peace and prosperity would best be served if politics stopped at the shores of the Taiwan Strait. Thank you very much.